This is Project Warlock II. So the first Project Warlock got kind of overshadowed by the very excellent Dusk because it came out only a few days beforehand, but I thought it was a really interesting game with a lot of possibility for expansion and a really fun upgrade system that really changed how the game played, and the whole idea of like guns and magic together is always fun for me. So I really enjoyed Project Warlock, and I was really excited to see that they were actually going to make a full sequel. So here we are. Project Warlock 2 is currently in early access at the time of recording this video. It just came into early access actually, and it has the first set of levels as well as the first of 3 characters that you can play as, and it's promising to have a different set of weapons and powers for each of the 3 characters, so kind of like Hexen a little bit actually. And this is very much in the old school vein of sequels, as in it's basically the same thing but more so, which is one of my favorite kinds of sequels, and it does a really good job at that. This is Project Warlock, but expanded in every sense of the word. As you can probably tell if you weren't familiar with the original, it is in fact an old school classic FPS, i.e. a boomer shooter, and it is very good at that, but it does use a lot of newer school mechanics melded with the older school stuff to create a really fun fusion. This game is almost like a sort of Doom Eternal enemy count kind of game, by which I mean it is focused very heavily on very, very large combats with a large number of enemies, a lot of enemies in this game. Just to put it into perspective, the very first level of the game, the E1M1, has about 570 enemies on it, so you're looking at a very high enemy count. However, this game, in my opinion, manages to avoid one of the big problems that some FPS that focus on very high enemy engagements have, which is that they sometimes become a bit of a slog, because it's basically a hallway connected to a room that's going to spawn a bunch of enemies, and once you beat all of them, you go through another hallway connected to another room that's going to spawn a bunch of enemies, and you just sort of repeat that, like the Serious Sam kind of formula, and this doesn't do that. It has very large set-piece battles with huge numbers of enemies, but it manages to make each one more memorable by not having very many of them per level. There are only a few of those huge-scale battles. The rest of the level is a very, very large, sprawling landscape that almost has like a Metroidvania feel to it, honestly, although it is not a Metroidvania, just to be clear. It is individual level-based. It is not one contiguous open world, but the levels themselves do have a sort of mini Metroidvania feel to them and how they actually progress. And you manage to have these really huge enemy counts on a level without the levels feeling like slogs, because they're just so big that you can have smaller scatterings of enemies all over the place and then only have a few of those really big encounters, and it all adds up to being a very high enemy count sort of game. The first character we have access to currently has some pretty fun weapons. It is a relatively standard FPS arsenal, but with some neat twists to it. So you at first will have a claymore, just a sword, and it is useful because of course it has infinite ammo. Instead it uses stamina that recharges over time to swing, and is actually pretty satisfying to use because you can cleave through large numbers of enemies very quickly with it because of the horde-based encounters that often happen. And then you will get an assault rifle that is a pretty basic, just standard assault rifle, works well, pretty accurate, and it has to reload every 30 rounds. You will then get the super shotgun, which is a very good interpretation of a super shotgun. Really nice double barrel. You fire 1 barrel at a time, so you get 2 shots per reload. It has a really nice sound asset to it that's very punchy and impactful, and it feels really good to turn enemies into clouds of mist with it because it is very effective. You will then get the cannon, which is sort of like the rocket launcher of the game, at least of this character in the game, and it's just like a single target, very high damage, low fire rate, low ammo weapon. Really good for your big scary enemies or bosses. And then you will also get the staff, which is sort of like the BFG, you could say, for this character. It has very rare ammo that it consumes very quickly, but it does a ton of damage. It sprays a bunch of projectiles everywhere, so it acts a little bit more like the plasma gun from Doom, but it has the damage of the BFG, if that makes sense. You also are equipped with 3 different magical powers that you can use, 3 different spells. The first that you'll get is a really awesome akimbo spell that basically just creates a spectral image of whatever weapon you're holding at the time and allows you to dual wield it. This means you can dual wield every weapon in the game, which is amazing. And it allows you to just shred hordes of enemies with dual assault rifles, or do ridiculous sort of burst damage with dual super shotguns and stuff like that. And yes, you can even dual wield the staff, although you will run through your ammo almost instantly if you do this, but it is very effective against like hordes of enemies or one very large enemy like a boss. So yeah, the dual wield power is really awesome, and you will continually find a use for it because of the very large encounters. It is really fun to pop and just go to town on a huge horde of enemies with. You will then get a freeze power that is an AoE centered on you and will freeze all enemies around you. This even works on really large enemies and bosses, although it won't freeze them for very long. And yes, the enemies do shatter in a really satisfying way if you then hit them with further damage. So this is really nice when you get surrounded or when you get overwhelmed by like hordes of smaller enemies. You can just freeze them all in place and then break out the shotgun and just shatter them all in one big cloud. It's really nice, actually. And then finally, you will get a sort of fireball power. It sprays out a sort of medium range stream of fireballs in front of you that deal very large damage to clouds of clustered enemies, as well as very high damage over time to single large enemies. And it's pretty fun to use, although you do have to be kind of careful using it because it sort of obscures your vision a little bit, and because of the really high enemy counts, there's often a ton of projectiles and crap headed your way that you have to dodge out of the way of, so be careful not to blind yourself with it. So that is overall the arsenal that you're working with in the current version of the game. That is the first character's setup, and it's really fun to use. All the weapons feel really good, the spells are fun, they work on this cooldown system where every spell has its own separate cooldown, and when you kill enemies in quick succession, you start a combo. And as you chain more and more fast kills on all the enemies around you, this combo will continue to increase, and as you combo stuff, enemies will drop extra items. They'll drop cooldown reductions for any of your spells that are currently on cooldown. Each one is color-coded, and you can pick those up, and you can actually make it to where if you just really shred through a huge cloud of enemies with like your akimbo power, you can actually restore the cooldown right as soon as the power ends, and you can have it ready to use again afterwards. So it rewards skilled play by allowing you to, do a lot of chain kills and get your cooldowns back faster that way. The game also uses somewhat of a strange armor economy kind of system. Normally in, boomer shooters, you just have armor pickups that give you armor, and that armor reduces the damage you take. It's very simple, and different colors of armor give you different totals of armor when you pick them up. But this game does it a little bit different. Instead, there are actually two different colors of armor, and they act differently. So you can find armor shards that will just give you one of whatever armor you currently have, and you can also find the actual full armor pickups of each color that will give you a bunch of armor and change your color to that one that you just picked up. So there's blue, which will reduce damage by, I think, 25%, and there's yellow, which will reduce damage by 50%, I think. And either way, yellow is much better. It's like double as good. And so you want to keep yellow armor as much as possible, but of course yellow armor is much more rare to find, and is generally in secrets and things. You don't find it in the normal level progression very often. It is here and there, but for the most part you'll find yellow armor in secrets. But this means that you have to be careful about which armor pickups you're actually running into, because if you have yellow and you run into a blue suit of armor, it'll change you back to blue. So there is a bit of sort of pickup management in this game to make sure that you don't constantly shift your armors back and forth and actually waste really good armor. One thing I'm really glad they carried over from the original Project Warlock is the weapon upgrade system. Throughout the levels, you'll find these upgrade stations. Oftentimes these are also in secrets, but generally there's at least one that's relatively obvious in a level, and then another one that's in the secrets. That's what I've tended to found so far. And every weapon has two mutually exclusive upgrade sort of paths that you can choose. You can only go for one at a time, and that upgrade also has its own upgrade that adds a secondary fire to the weapon depending on which of the two you chose. So, for example, the Super Shotgun has the auto-loader upgrade that auto-reloads it and gives you a much higher rate of fire, and it also has the flak cannon upgrade for that, which gives you like a flak cannon sort of bouncy shot that you can do as a secondary. Or you can get a quad barrel upgrade, giving it 4 barrels, and then give the all-shot upgrade to that, making your secondary fire shoot all 4 barrels at once. You can guess which one I went for, and this also means that if you use the akimbo power-up, you have 8 barrels of Super Shotgun to face down your enemies with, and it is really, really satisfying. And yes, if you use your secondary when you have the akimbo spell going, you do unload all 8 barrels at once, and so far I haven't found a single enemy in the game that can survive that, except for the bosses. This is a really awesome system and is my favorite part of the whole Project Warlock thing, because the different upgrades for your weapons tend to be really significant. They tend to change how you actually use that weapon. The cannon can turn into the super cannon, which will actually fire through enemies railgun style but is affected by gravity, and you can turn it into a rocket launcher that way. The staff can actually turn into like a chain lightning staff that pierces through everything and goes through your ammo really, really fast. So every weapon has these two different sort of paths it can go down, and it does very much change how that weapon acts, which is really cool. The levels themselves, as I mentioned, are a massive sprawling affair. It took me like 40 minutes to get through the first level, although I was trying to check everywhere and doubling back and trying to find secrets and things, and I still only found half the secrets and I missed 20 kills somewhere. So the levels are gigantic, and this is going to be a bit of a point of contention for the game because some people are going to feel that the levels are too big and complex and could easily be split in half into 2 separate levels to sort of pad out the level count of the game and making each one smaller and more manageable. Personally, I actually like the levels the way they are. I like the feeling of this huge, giant, sprawling, almost Metroidvania-like level structure. That means each level has a lot of different environments to go through. Generally, one level is not one environment. Yeah, you have like 2 or 3 different sort of biomes within a level, and often a couple of different enemy sets as well, so the levels vary a lot as you progress through them. Now, in my opinion, the levels actually have really good signposting for the most part, so even though they're very, very large and often non-linear in places, you don't get lost that easily because there are symbols and flames and torches and stuff everywhere that help kind of lead you around, and it's also really good at spawning new enemies in the direction that you're meant to go to sort of help to lead you through the level in a more predictable way so you don't get lost. I will say, though, there have been a couple of levels where I did get a little bit lost towards the end when I had cleared out most of it but couldn't quite figure out like where that one switch opened. It's not quite like Hexen levels of you hit a switch, some door opens somewhere on the level, go find it. It doesn't really do that, but it does, since they're so large, you do have to do a little bit of backtracking here and there. So yeah, like I said, the levels are definitely going to be something you either love or hate, and it's probably going to be a long-term discussion on the forums and stuff between the people that really enjoy the sprawling, massive level design and the people that think they could be reduced in size a lot and sort of split in half into 2 separate maps instead. But one thing I was really impressed by is the enemy variety. Generally speaking, in an FPS that's in early access, the enemy variety is one of the last things that gets bumped up towards the end near the release. And when it's first released, the enemy variety is relatively low because that's just something that you work on later once you have the levels more in place and the weapons in place and stuff like that, because usually the enemy variety depends heavily on what sort of tools that you're going to have to deal with those enemies and what places you're going to fight those enemies in. So, you know, you don't add a bunch of new enemies until you have those other systems in place first, but in this game is actually a surprising variety of enemies to face. And even late in the current campaign, you're still seeing new enemies pop up here and there to surprise you, and they tend to have some really fun weapons and tactics and things, like the crazy necromancer enemies that turn it into a bullet hell and can raise other dead enemies like Archvile style. Those are pretty cool. And there's also some really big, scary enemies, although in my opinion, I will say that I think some of the larger enemies' silhouettes are too similar to each other, so it's harder to tell them apart at a glance, and it's kind of necessary to tell them apart because some of them are like melee only and others are able to shoot rockets at you and things, so it's nice to be able to tell them apart. It's not a massive problem, but I do think that some of the big, scary, armored enemies look a little bit too similar in terms of silhouette and can maybe be differentiated a little bit visually. But overall, I really like the enemies in this game. They're fun to fight. None of them feel overly spongy. It helps keep your weapons and spells satisfying, but also it keeps the difficulty up because, of course, there are a lot of enemies on screen at any given time, and some of them actually remind me of Quake enemies in terms of how they act, which is pretty cool. And there are currently 2 different difficulty modes in the game, and I'm playing on the harder difficulty just to see what it's like, and I'm finding it very manageable but definitely challenging. So overall, I've really enjoyed my time with Project Warlock 2. It's got nice music, it's got really satisfying movement, it's got awesome weapons and a fun upgrade system, fun spells to use, although they might not be quite as powerful as they could be, just considering the massive waves of enemies you're going against. They could be maybe a little bit more AoE to sort of help deal with that because of their long cooldowns and such. But if there were some complaints that I could come up with, some things in terms of, you know, since it's early access, what could be altered or fixed. For one, I did mention that a couple of levels are a little bit harder to navigate than others. I think some extra signposting in some of those levels towards the end would be really nice because they can get a bit labyrinthine at times, and sometimes it's a little bit easy to lose where you need to go. The map does help, but there are a couple of sections that they go on for quite some time, and it can be a little bit hard to remember where you are, especially because some of the levels actually close off earlier bits and you can no longer get to certain parts of them at late in the levels and stuff like that. It makes some of them a little bit more confusing to navigate than they could be. I have found a couple of bugs. For one, it's really easy to get stuck on level geometry. That definitely needs to be fixed. The movement feels very smooth and nice. You have a lot of air control and you move quite quickly, but especially when it comes to corners, small bits of scenery that are hard to notice, notice chains and stuff like that, as well as small ledges, it's kind of easy to get stuck and have to sort of wiggle your way out of them, which is obviously a bit of a death sentence in a game as fast-paced as this, so that definitely needs to be fixed. I've also found that there are a couple of instances where the hitboxes on your weapon will stop working, especially the laser rifle. The laser rifle's hitbox is kind of weird and often ignores terrain, not because it's supposed to pierce things, but because it just goes through things without interacting at all. For instance, it's really hard to shoot and destroy explosive barrels with the laser rifle because the projectile often just phases through them and doesn't do anything. And there have also been a couple of times where enemies have just totally stopped responding to whatever weapon I was equipped with at the time, and I had to switch to a different weapon to actually start hitting them again. So it seems like there's some hitbox issues with some of the weapons here and there. Not a major problem, but enough that it definitely needs to be looked at. I would say, as far as some things that I'd like to see, for one, I think it would be nice to have more music tracks for each of the levels. Because the levels are so long, you will be hearing one music track for quite some time, and oftentimes, since the level completely changes biomes by the end, it would be kind of cool to have like a dynamic track change that alters the music as you go through the levels to a different track once the level has changed significantly enough. And also, I have a bit of an idea for one of the characters. I think it would be really fun to have sort of a magey focused character, because we obviously have a more weapon focused character right now, in the form of like a modal character, as in someone that can change between two different forms, and the rest of their spells and weapons change depending on what form they're in. So you could have like an ice form, and then their other two spells are ice spells, and their weapons like a shotgun that fires ice shards and things like that, and then you can use their main spell to switch forms to, say, a lightning form that has like a chain lightning rifle and some lightning spells. Of course, there are a lot of ways to do a character like this. It doesn't have to be ice and lightning, it could be sun and moon or dark and light or whatever you want to make, but I think it would be really fun to have a sort of modal character whose arsenal changes between two separate sets that you have to switch between as sort of like a high skill magey character. That'd be a lot of fun to play. So that is my current look at Project Warlock 2 as it is when it has just released into early access. It's a really satisfying shooter that does a really good job of mixing old and new elements together to create a really fun fusion, some very satisfying combat, and really nice sprawling level design that probably won't be for everyone, but is still really enjoyable to go through. I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page for the early access campaign. You can check it out yourself. In my opinion, yes, it is worth its current asking price if you want to get into it, because the levels are so big and there are quite a few of them in the currently available campaign. It will last you for quite some time. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.